What's up guys? In this video we're going to talk about SQL injections. If you don't know, it is one of the top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities. You can see it's here sitting currently in third place. Now if you have no idea what SQL injection is, let's jump down here to the description and you see that it says it is a vulnerability when user supplied data is not validated, filtered, or sanitized by the application. So let's break it down. What does that mean? Well, you have a programming language such as PHP, for example, interacting with a database, and for some reason the code is not properly sanitized, so it is not accounting for mistakes and manipulation of the URL and other user submitted data, which in turn allows us to get a hold of the database's content and potentially access usernames, passwords, and whatever other content you might have in there. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at this tutorial. I have a few labs that I programmed for us with vulnerabilities that I left there on purpose so we can understand how to abuse SQL injections, both by using a program like sqlmap and also how to do it manually so we can understand what a program like sqlmap is actually doing. So let's jump into it. Alright, to start off, if you want to get this lab up and running on your own computer, you can check out this article I wrote, and it's gonna show you basically how to set it up on your machine. I made a detailed tutorial for both Windows and Linux, and you can also find the HTML and PHP files right there for you to download. I will link it down below in case you want to check that out, and without further ado, let's check the web page. Alright, so here's the web page that I programmed for this lab. Today we'll be focusing on the classic SQL injection part, and I'll have another few parts coming in other videos. You can also download the files and check the code. This way it'll allow you to understand where the SQL injection is taking place, especially when it comes down to the PHP code over here. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and jump to the hero page over here. And once we head over to this page, you can see we have a classic index.php URL. There's no parameters yet. Once we go ahead and click on one of these heroes, you can see the URL has changed and we're now passing the hero parameter to the database, and that's fetching this data over here, right? So that's where we can spot a potential for SQL injection. Now notice that these parameters can be passed in different ways to the web page. So for this tutorial we're going to keep it simple and look at a classic case of SQL injection. And to start off, we're going to abuse this SQL injection using sqlmap, which is probably the most popular SQL injection tool. If you don't have sqlmap installed, you can go ahead and download it from sqlmap.org. You do have to make sure you got Python 3 installed, and once you do, you can just go ahead and run it. So yeah, let's begin. So let's take this URL over here with the parameter. So we have index.php, hero equals vi, and we're gonna copy that. And let me open a command here, and let's do sqlmap. And we're gonna pass the URL like that. You can see it's testing for the different types of SQL injections. Possible database identified as MySQL. Do you wish to skip test payloads for other database managers? Yes. And we'll just hit yes here as well. Now you can see this is running very fast because this is from a local server, so of course it's going to be quick. With actual web pages you might have to wait a little bit longer. And there we have it. Get parameter hero is generic union query, 1 to 2 columns, injectable. So that means the parameter is vulnerable. Do you want to keep testing for others? We can go ahead and hit no, since that is the parameter we are trying to attack anyways. And cool, and here it actually gives you the different types of SQL injection vulnerabilities. You can see Boolean based blind, error based, union query, and time-based blind. So that's all pretty cool. Now let's proceed the same way we would using sqlmap to extract data from a target. So in this case, we would now do dbs to fetch the databases. There we go. This fetched all 6 databases, and some of these are the default MySQL databases. And let's say we're interested in this arcane database over here. We would now do tables and D for arcane, where we are, oops, so let's do arcane, where arcane is a database and we're trying to get the tables from it. Alright, there we go. So we have 2 tables, one called heroes, another called users. Now let's say we want to get the columns from the users table, since we want to fetch the usernames and passwords. We would change here to columns, and then we would do database arcane and -t capital T users, where that is the table name. And there we have it. This gives us the setup for the columns. You can see we have user, ID, and pass. Now finally, if we wanted to go ahead and dump the data inside of this table, we can just go ahead and do a dump, where database is arcane and table is users, and that should give us the values from it. And there we have it. ID 1, password 123456, user for effects. So we've gone ahead and accessed all the information from the database using sqlmap, and that's pretty cool. That was quick, mostly because it is a local server, and it does give you here the payloads that it's using. So you can see union query, time-based blind, and these are the different queries that you could use to extract that same data. But what is really happening here? If you're just using sqlmap, you might be missing on a lot of information when it comes to actually understanding the vulnerability. So that's why I came up with these labs, so that we could go ahead and dive into how we would do this manually and progressively advance into the different forms of attacks, so we can understand it better and potentially attack websites that are vulnerable in a way where sqlmap's default attacks wouldn't actually be effective. So now let's jump into some manual attacks so we can further investigate this vulnerability. So to start off, the first thing you want to do is you want to put an apostrophe right here and see if it spits out any type of errors. And there we go. So in this case, it gives us a fatal error, and that's how we can tell that there is a potential for SQL injection here. In this specific case, you can see it actually gives us info from the SQL statement being passed from PHP to the SQL database. Now you might not always get this lucky. Of course, I programmed this vulnerability there on purpose, as you'll be able to see from the PHP scripts in here. But in a lot of cases, you might actually not get any type of error, but the web page itself might still be vulnerable to SQL injection. But let's continue from now. So we get this error here. So we're like, hey, we can actually complete the SQL statement and get other data from the database instead. So one of the first things you might want to do is to get the version from MySQL, and we could do that using a union statement. Like we saw here on sqlmap, you can see the union query that was used to extract data from the database. Now union allows us to add other data to the SQL statement and potentially extract more information from different databases, different tables, different columns. So that's the method we're gonna use for today. It will be a union query. So let's see how we would go about getting information from the database manually using a union query. So we know that this hero parameter here is vulnerable. What we're gonna do is we add this apostrophe here, and the reason for the apostrophe is if we take a look at the code, where is it? So this is the SQL statement. Now, why do we get an error? Well, you can see the apostrophes right here. So once we add an apostrophe, suddenly the statement becomes this. That means that the statement is incomplete at the moment because it's expecting it to go further. Now, once you see the code, you can start to understand how these injections are taking place. So let me go ahead and do a union query statement so we can extract the version from MySQL manually. So we're gonna do union all select, and this is very typical. We usually add a concat statement here, and this is what we use to get, let's say, two different values from a table. In this case, we're only gonna do parentheses version like that, and we'll do from information schema dot schemata, and we add a hyphen hyphen space hyphen. Now the reason we do these is so we can comment out the rest of the SQL statement. So let's say we copy this, and looking here in the page, imagine that now this is going to be the full statement that we're running. So even if we had some other continuation of the statement here, it's being commented out anyway. So it shouldn't return an error from the web page because we're commenting out the rest. So let me retract this, save it. And another thing that's very common here is instead of doing an actual parameter here, a lot of people will do a -1 or just a negative number so that we don't actually pull any of this data and resolve the statement by itself. So let's run it like this and see if we can successfully get the MySQL version from the schemata database. And there we go. You can see now the statement resolved correctly and it returned the 10.4.22 Mariah database. So that's pretty cool, and that's how we would begin to extract the data manually in a way where we can actually understand the SQL injection and the statements taking place in the database. So let me get rid of this, and now let's say we want to get the database name. So we would do concat, and we can use the database name here on concat. So we use the database function from information schema dot schemata, and let's run that and see what we get here. And there we go, we got the arcane database because that is the database active for this web page at the moment. So that's pretty cool. We got the database. Now we need to be able to get the tables, right? So let's see how we would do to get the tables in here. So using the union all select concat, we can do table schema, and this time we have to do, alright, so we'll do table schema from information schema dot tables, where table schema equals database. So one thing you have to understand as well is because of the PHP query taking place here, we're only getting the results from a single row. So what does that mean? We can't actually get more than one result at a time. Now, it's important for you to understand how the programming language is resolving it, because you might try to get more information than the code is actually parsing, which will end up in you not getting any data back from the database. And this is where the magic all takes place. Once you understand this and you understand how the code is resolving the SQL statement, then you can extract it properly. And the reason I mention this is because one parameter that you'll be using very often is the limit parameter, and that allows you to get one result at a time from the database. So in this case, we'll do limit, and let's do 0 to 1. So what this means is we'll be resolving just the first result from this statement over here. Oh, I got a wrong value here, so this should be table name. Yep, let me go ahead and copy this, and let's see if we're able to get the first table. Alright, there we go. So we got first table is called heroes, which is the table on this page over here. Now all we got to do is change limit 0 1 to limit 1 to 2, and there we have it. There's a table called users. Now this should be an interesting table for us to start extracting the columns from it. And of course we need the columns, because if we want to dump data from the columns, we have to actually enumerate the columns. And this is a lot of the work that sqlmap is automating for us. But it's also work that once you understand it, you can start to extract data manually in a way that will bypass a web application firewall and things of that sort, where sqlmap might not necessarily help you with. So let's take a look at how to get the column's name now. And now what we'll do is we'll do concat column name from information schema dot columns, where table name equals users table, so ID. Oh, I should have copied that. Let's copy this. User and pass. Sweet. So with this information, we're now able to dump specific data from these columns. Now to dump this, we can use a union all select concat, and we can do user. This is going to be a hexadecimal for a double dot here, so we can separate the user and the password. And we do from users, and this over here should resolve properly. Let me add an extra hyphen over here just for good measure, and there we have it. So we have just manually extracted this data here, where this is the username, that is the password from the database. So for effects 1 2 3 4 5 6, and if we go back here on the login page, we can do for effects 1 2 3 4 5 6, submit, user and password are correct. So yeah, there we go. That's how we manually extract the data from the database using SQL injection parameters. This is a typical classic error-based vulnerability, and we're just getting started with the SQL injections, and I do recommend you take a look at the code as well. That way you can understand and you can actually complete the queries, and you can see why it makes sense, for example, when we add this union query here, you can understand that suddenly this apostrophe over here will be jumped to here, and this is the query we're actually inserting, and this will comment out this part of the code, and suddenly it starts to make sense how SQLmap operates and how we can go ahead and extract this data manually. Now that's going to be it for this one, and I'll see you next time.